So they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And generally, when people say that, it means, all right, when you've reached a certain age, it becomes pretty much impossible to learn anything new. And while that is not entirely true, the reason it is a saying is because the majority of people, for the most of history, it is difficult to learn new tricks when you get to a certain age. And the reason it is difficult to learn new things when you get past a certain age is because you just have more time to actually pattern and train and program your brain into a certain mode of operation. And so for most people, when it comes to learning new skills, when it comes to starting new ventures, they actually never get to a stage where that new habit or that new skill has become ingrained in them, because you have to go through such a sticky and difficult process in order to get to the stage of actually being rewarded for new tasks and new skills. Now, what the hell do I mean by that? All right, so just for example, in my own life, generally the familiar are things that I'm pretty competent in. All right, so I spend most of my time, going to the gym where I feel pretty competent. I've been training for many, many years. I work on specific projects that I know I'm an expert in, I know I'm good at. I typically cook the same meal over and over again. And so in a way, all of these habits are ingrained in me as skills. Now, anytime I try and do something new, and for example, learning to surf here in Bali, I initially absolutely sucked at it because it was a new experience. So I didn't have any skill in that area. And so anytime I would try and get better at it, like every session I'd go out, I'd fall, I'd crash, and I'd be like, this flipping sucks. I'd feel incredibly uncomfortable around it. And anytime anyone would invite me to go surfing, I'd be like, bro, you know what? I'm actually okay. And so what is basically happening in my brain at that point, because surfing actually felt terrible to me, was all down to this neuron in your brain. And it all comes down to something that's happening in the brain. All right, so there's actually a reason for it. And it all comes down to your dopamine receptors, your dopamine neurons. And so there's basically a really cool story which sort of illustrates what's going on in adult learning here. Basically, they did a series of tests on a group of monkeys where they wanted to scan the brain and see when dopamine was released in the brain. And so what they did was they gave the monkeys a glass of orange juice, which obviously acted as a reward or acted as an action, which created a response and a release of dopamine in the neurons in the brain. And typically this is happening in the mammalian section of the brain, so it's really deep rooted. And so what they actually found was that the dopamine was being released when the orange juice was given, but over time, the monkeys learned the pattern of the doctors walking into the laboratory. And so when the door would open, the dopamine was actually released before the orange juice was given. And then what they found was actually over time, and that pattern getting ingrained in the monkeys, the dopamine actually got released earlier and earlier and earlier. And so it actually started getting released when the doctors would walk down the hallway. And then it would be even further on. And so then it would even start patterning into the time that it would happen. And so what's interesting about this is it means that dopamine neurons are actually predictive neurons, which means they are actively predicting what's going to happen in the environment and when can they start releasing dopamine. For example, if you scroll on your phone a lot, the reason you want to pick that phone up to scroll and see X is because it releases basically a hit of dopamine. And so if you don't do that action, if you take that stimulus away, you basically starve yourself of that dopamine hit. And so what happens when you starve yourself of that action, it creates a prediction error. And a prediction error in the brain is created when a prediction doesn't come right. So for example, with the monkeys, if the doctors walked down the hall, opened the door, but didn't give them the orange juice, that would break the pattern and no dopamine would be released. Okay, which would create a series of stress hormones. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because it's very, very important, because this is happening to you every single day. So when the dopamine gets released, when the orange juice gets taken, or I go onto social media, it doesn't actually feel amazing to me. All it does is feel normal, okay, because you are still in the familiar. Therefore, it doesn't actually change what's going on. I just feel normal. Okay, so you could say that you're in your comfort zone. But when you go out and you do something new, for example, a completely new activity like my surfing, when I get into that situation, my brain has no pattern or nothing to tell me or to reward me for that action. So there's no dopamine being released. And so actually what's happening in that new situation is my brain is creating a prediction error, which creates a series of stress hormones. So it's a stress response. The reason this is very, very important, and this is the kicker, is because in adult learning, we have so many things ingrained in us, so many patterns, just like the monkeys, that create dopamine reactions and make us feel normal. And so even if those behaviors are destructive, like arguing with your spouse or smoking weed or smoking cigarettes or staying up late doing stupid things, okay, you're still going to get a dopamine hit from those things. Okay, which means you're going to be in your familiar and you're going to be comfortable. And so any single time you stop doing those things, your brain creates a prediction error, because it's like, where's my hit of dopamine? Now you feel shit. All right. So in order to basically break out of those habitual patterns and create new habits and new patterns, then you have to basically step out of your comfort zone. And that's why people say moving out of your comfort zone is very difficult, but that's where growth happens. And it's entirely true. But this is what's happening in your brain, all right? And so the way that you actually start programming yourself for a new set of behaviors, whether it is surfing in my instance, or whether it is creating a business or posting content online, you have to be able to go through a period of time where the prediction error is happening. However, you're staying in the stress and the discomfort of it until your brain creates a new pattern and then eventually starts rewarding you with dopamine. Okay, and so that might take 6 months. All right, for example, for surfing, for me, it took ages. It actually got to a stage where I was like, you know what, I'm gonna quit. And my partner came over to me and she said, hey Luke, just come one more time. And I went one more time and I had a great surf, caught a cool wave, and some dopamine was released, and I was like, holy crap, this is awesome. I want to keep doing this. All right, and so that behavior started to become ingrained in me, and that's where people start saying things like, oh, I'm hooked. That's when people start saying things like, oh, I'm hooked on that new activity, okay? Because, for example, running, right? Running sucks initially, but once you get to the point where you've broken past the prediction error and your brain starts learning this new pattern, it'll start rewarding you with dopamine, and that's when you get things like the runner's high, is what they talk about. All right, so for you would get an experience of the business high. For example, if you're afraid of making sales, or if you're afraid of posting content, or you're afraid of doing anything. It's like all of these new experiences to you just need to be stuck at long enough for your brain to start rewarding you. And so that's why adult learning is so difficult, okay? Because you have ingrained patterns, ingrained beliefs, ingrained mechanisms to release dopamine, and it's very, very difficult to move out of them because it is out of the familiar. It is uncomfortable because your brain doesn't recognize it, but it just requires you to do repetition until new neurons are created in your brain, so you learn new patterns and you get rewarded for things like going to the gym. You get rewarded for eating healthily. You get rewarded for making sales in your business. You get rewarded for producing content. You get rewarded for meditation. All right? All of these things come with time. And that's why the beginner journey is really, really difficult. And that's why if you're starting a business for the first time, or if you're in business, it sucks for the first few months. And even for the first few years, it really, really sucks. All right? It's beginner hell. And the reason it's beginner hell is because it's devoid of any dopamine. And in fact, you actually have to let go of dopamine releasing activities in order to free up more time so you can focus on the things that matter most. All right, so, this is no joke. All right, it's no joke actually getting, starving yourself of these things, because when a baby is born, everything is a new experience, right? Everything's a new experience. So new neurons are being creating all the time. They're learning constantly. And so when you're an adult and you're learning, you've got a lot more to compete with, okay? And especially if you're further on in life, you got even more to compete with. You got even more to sort of get down with. But the beautiful thing is, it can be learned. New skills can be learned, but it requires you to unlearn the destructive behaviors. And the way you unlearn them is by removing focus and removing time away from those things and putting that attention and time into something else. Because it all comes down to the release of dopamine in your brain. So if you can start to understand that learning process, to understand the mechanism for learning a new skill and doing something new, you can literally learn anything. You can do any skill. but it just requires you to sit in the discomfort for long enough. Now, a thing that helps with that massively is a mentor and a guide who's done what you're trying to do. Because if you don't have that, you will suffer with what we call experiential blindness. You don't necessarily, especially when tasks get complex, you can't see your blind spots and you can't necessarily know what steps to take if someone's not pointing it out to you that has been on your path. All right, my friend, I hope you found this useful. I'll see you on the next one.